Hi there, Sugar Snaps. I'm Brittany from Textile Indie, and today I'm going to be dyeing with Black-Eyed Susan. Black-Eyed Susan is a yellow flower with a dark center. It's part of the Rudbeckia family of flowers, and it supposedly creates a minty sage green dye if you allow the flowers to simmer at 180 degrees for a extended period of time. So I'm gonna go through that process with you today. I'm experimenting, so I'm learning along with you. Use my notes along the way to help you do your Black-Eyed Susan dyeing. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to measure out my weight of fiber. So your weight of fiber, or WOF, is the amount of fiber you will be dyeing. And I have pre-mordanted wool yarn in order to do this, and I've used a 10% alum and 7% cream of tartar ratio. So you take the weight of fiber that you are going to be dyeing, and then you do the calculation of the mordant in order to mordant the fiber. Mordants help the natural dye to bind to the surface of the fiber and help them to last longer through washes and sunlight. So you can check out this video on how to do alum mordanting on wool yarn or wool fiber to prepare your own yarn for Black-Eyed Susan dyeing. So I have a bag here of wool fiber that I have pre-mordanted, and I mordanted this a few days ago, and then I pulled it out of the mordant bath and stuck it in a Ziploc bag damp. And stuck it in the fridge. So put it in the fridge so that it doesn't start to mildew. And you can pre-mordant your fiber ahead of time and then have it in the fridge for up to 2 weeks in order to naturally dye over time. So I'm doing some test dyeing, so I decided to pre-mordant a bunch of yarn in order to do this project. So I have here a skein of wool yarn that's mordanted with alum and cream of tartar. And I need to measure out my dye stuff and the weight of fiber, the amount of yarn I'm using, in order to calculate how much of the flowers to use in the dyeing process. I could use all of these flowers or do a ratio of equal parts weight of fiber and weight of dye stuff. So to do that calculation, I'm going to turn on my scale and I'm going to weigh out my skein of wool. And I've got 4.3 ounces of mordanted fiber. Now this is wet. This is wet fiber, so I'm going to take off an ounce of that number. So it was 4.3. I'm going to consider an ounce of that is the water weight, and so I'll consider it 3.3 ounces. So then I'm going to use this bowl. So I'll dump these into this pot for the moment. Use this bowl, set it on there and tare it so that it's set to 0, so that it's not calculating the bowl weight. And then I'll pour the petals in, or the flower heads in. And I have 4.1. So I could go down to 3.3. I could remove some flowers until I have 3.3 ounces of flowers, or just use all the dye stuff. And I think I'm going to use all of this. I went out this morning and picked these out of my garden, and so I want to use them while they're still fresh. The best results for Black-Eyed Susan dyeing come from fresh flower heads, because the petals still have the pigment in them and they haven't dried out. So you're using the freshest possible aspects of the natural pigments. So to create the dye bath, I'm going to rinse off these flowers. These are freshly picked out of the garden, and they still have a little bit of dirt and maybe some bugs in them. And so I'm going to rinse these off in the sink and let them soak in the water for a few minutes to allow all the debris to either sink or rise to the surface, and then drain them out so it's just the flowers left, and then I'll come back and we'll work on adding them to the pot. Be sure to use lukewarm or cold water when you rinse flowers for natural dyeing. You don't want to wither the petals before you add it to the dye bath. So use the cool water to rinse them off. Okay, I've rinsed the flowers. Now I have a pot here, and as you can see, I have dyeing written on the side of this pot. This pot I only use for natural dyeing or chemical dyeing. I don't use it in the kitchen, and I don't cook with it. When you are naturally dyeing, be sure to use tools that you only use for natural dyeing, because you'll be working with some chemicals, things like alum, and potentially other mordants, and natural dyes. They're natural, but it doesn't mean they're always non-toxic. So just keeping everything separate is better for your health. It is just a good precaution to take. You can also wear a mask when you're working, making natural dyes. I've pre-mordanted my yarn, and that is definitely when I would wear a mask and wear my rubber gloves and go through the whole process of making sure I don't get it on my skin. With the Black Eyed Susan dye, I'm not worried about the fumes or it splashing onto my skin, so I'm not going to worry about wearing the gloves or the mask today. But just keep that in mind when naturally dyeing. It's just a good precaution to take. So now I'm going to add these flowers to my dye pot, and this is just an empty pot. An empty pot for the dye bath. And then I'm going to fill this up 3/4 of the way full with warm water, not hot water, warm water, and then put it on the stove to start to simmer. And I want it to reach 180 degrees and then hold at 180 degrees for 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how much dye I want to extract from these flowers. So when you're using heat to extract dye from a natural material or an organic material like flowers or leaves or bark, it's called heat extraction or an extraction bath, because you're using heat to extract the pigment from the natural material. So we'll do a heat extraction bath with these Black Eyed Susan. So now go fill up your pot 3/4 of the way full with warm water. Okay, it's actually been 2 hours since I put the Black Eyed Susan flowers into the pot for extraction bath, and I let it go for 2 hours because at an hour I checked it and the water wasn't as dark as I wanted it to be. So you can change the time that it sits on the stove depending on how much extraction you want to occur and how much you notice if there is pigment in the water. So I'll open the pot up here and show you what's going on. And all the flowers have sunk to the bottom because I put the lid on and I let it sit. But I've got a nice dark murky liquid dye bath, and all the flowers and petals have kind of disintegrated a bit at the bottom. Okay, now I'm going to transfer the dye bath into this bowl and strain out all of the plant debris. So first of all, if you're working on a surface that you don't want to get heat damaged, make sure that your pot and whatever you're transferring the liquid into is on a hot pad. Okay, so I'll set my bowl on a hot pad, put the strainer into my bowl and let it sit on the edge there. And I'm gonna have to work carefully because this is just teetering on the edge there. So I'm gonna carefully, this liquid is very hot, so work somewhere safe or have someone help you do this. Pour it into your bowl, and there's the dye stuff at the bottom. I'm gonna try to strain all the water out. And if you can catch the dye stuff in the pot without having to dump it into your strainer. That works too. Go ahead and empty out your pot, dump all the excess flour bits into the garbage or compost. Okay, I've rinsed out my pot. It's nice and clean, no flour debris. I'm going to take these bowls and dump them back in. They're really hot because of the heat, so I'm gonna get some hot pads. That was messy. Natural dyeing is not a clean craft. You're gonna get splashes places. It's working with a lot of water, a lot of plants, and organic materials. So you're gonna have a lot of cleaning up, transferring things around, dumping liquids from pot to pot, bowl to bowl. Okay, so I have my newly created dye pot. It's free of all plant debris. I just strained everything out. Now we put in our fiber into the pot and we let that simmer on the stove for an hour, or as long as you want to see how dark you can get the dye. So about an hour is average for dyeing natural dyes, dyeing with natural dyes, but you can go longer if you want to see how dark you can get your fiber. So I have my alum mordanted wool yarn, and I'm going to take it and dump it into this pot. And there's a lot of dye liquid in here for this amount of yarn, but I'm just going to put it in here and move it around a bit, and then transfer your pot back to the stove and put it on medium low and allow it to simmer for an hour, or as long as you want it to go to see what the dye does. So I've removed the yarn from the dye bath and rinsed it out, and I got a nice olive green color. I'm really happy with the color that it turned out. It turned out a lot darker than I expected, and I think that's because the amount of dye plant that I put into the dye pot was more weight than the dye material that I ended up dyeing. So I ended up with a nice pigmented bath that dyed this wool yarn very well. I went ahead, and because this turned out so dark, I wanted to see if I could use the rest of the dye bath to do a lighter skein of yarn, and so I added another skein of mordanted yarn to the dye bath. I'm going to do an exhaust dye to see if I can use all of the dye out of the dye water and get a slightly lighter color than this. Couple things that I noted as I was doing the dye process that I want to share with you so that you can be successful is that the dye bath will look pink. It looks pink, and I'll show you the video here. It looks pink as you're stirring it, as you put the yarn in, and it continues to look pink until a few, like 15 to 20 minutes into the dyeing process. Then you start to get the greenish hues. So just don't freak out when you see that. At first I was like, I don't want pink yarn, I want green. And but I went ahead and just let it sit in there for about an hour, and I ended up with a nice olive green color. So just be aware of that. Also, you don't have to dye the yarn for the whole hour. I chose to go for the full hour, but you can let it sit in there for 15 minutes, half hour, to full hour, depending on how dark you want your yarn to be. And that's totally personal preference. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this Dyeing with Black-Eyed Susan's video helpful. Share in the comments below if you try it out and have a success story, and if you have any questions, also leave a comment below. Subscribe to my channel so that you can get updated whenever I put out a new basket weaving, natural dyeing, spinning, or other fiber art video. And also check out my website, Textile Indie, where I have lots of posts on fiber arts as well as courses and other resources. Thanks for watching.